Chapter 5. The contagion spreads. The ship, once a familiar companion, had become a stranger. The constant groan of its timbers, a sound Thorn had known since he first set foot on a deck, now seemed to carry a different cadence, a mournful hum that vibrated deep within his bones. It was more than just the stress of the sea. It was a lament, a slow exhalation of the ship's very being, as if the ancient wood itself was slowly succumbing to a malady no physician could diagnose. He found himself listening intently, trying to decipher the subtle shifts in its tone, like a sailor trying to read the mood of a tempest. Sometimes a particular creak would sound unnervingly, like a stifled cry, a fleeting gasp swallowed by the indifferent roar of the waves. Other times, a prolonged groan from the bowels of the ship would mimic a sigh of profound weariness, as if the albatross was weary of carrying its cursed cargo. Elias, too, found his senses playing tricks on him. He would meticulously place his charts on the navigation table, ensuring they were perfectly aligned, only to glance away for a moment to check the rigging and find them shifted. Not by much, perhaps only an inch or two, but enough to sow a seed of doubt. The sextant, when he left it by the binnacle, would sometimes be found resting at a slightly different angle, its polished brass catching the dim lamplight in an unfamiliar glint. He'd rub his eyes, convinced he was mistaken, that fatigue was clouding his judgment, but the anomalies persisted. These were not the clumsy errors of a tired sailor. They were deliberate, almost playful, alterations that spoke of an intelligence at work, an unseen hand rearranging the familiar. He never mentioned these instances to Thorn directly, not wanting to add to the captain's evident disquiet, but the shared glances of unease between them were eloquent enough. The compass, that steadfast arbiter of direction, became a source of growing dread. For days, it pointed true, its needle a slender finger of certainty in a world that was rapidly losing its bearings. Then, without warning, it would falter. The needle would begin to quiver, then spin with a frantic, almost hysterical energy, as if possessed by an unseen madness. Thorn would watch it, his own heart mirroring its erratic dance, until as abruptly as it began, the spinning would cease, and the needle would settle, sometimes pointing north, sometimes west, sometimes in a direction that defied all logic, all nautical understanding. He found himself relying more and more on the stars, on the feel of the wind, on the subtle shifts in the ocean's swell, instincts that had been honed over years of experience, but even these felt less reliable now, tainted by the lingering shadow of Isla del Devorador. Elias, in his meticulous way, tried to rationalize these occurrences, attributing them to magnetic anomalies in the deep sea, or to fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. But deep down, both men knew that these were not natural phenomena. They were whispers from the abyss, subtle manifestations of a corruption that had taken root within the very soul of their ship. The brine spray that lashed against the albatross's hull, usually a clear testament to the ocean's purity, began to take on a peculiar quality. In the diffused light of dawn or dusk, Thorn could see, or perhaps thought he could see, fleeting, intricate geometric patterns forming within the glistening droplets. They were sharp, precise angles, complex tessellations that seemed to writhe for a moment before dissolving back into the formless spray. It was as if the very water, the essence of the sea, was being imprinted with the alien geometries of Isla del Devorador. He'd squint, trying to capture the ephemeral shapes, to pin them down with his gaze, but they were as elusive as smoke, as insubstantial as a dream. Yet the impression remained. a disquieting reminder of the island's insidious influence. He saw it too in the cracks that spiderwebbed across the aged timbers of the deck, lines that seemed to deepen and spread in unnatural, almost mathematical formations, as if the wood itself was reconfiguring according to an alien blueprint. The nightmares that plagued the crew were a more direct, albeit more subjective manifestation of the contagion. They were not mere bad dreams of storms or sea monsters, but vivid, disorienting experiences that left the sailors gasping for breath, their minds reeling. Thorn himself was not spared. He dreamt of endless, Escher-like staircases that spiraled into an impossible void, of chambers whose dimensions defied Euclidean geometry, of whispers in a language that was both ancient and utterly alien, a language that seemed to etch itself directly into his consciousness. He would wake with a scream caught in his throat, the phantom sensation of being trapped within a suffocating, impossible space, clinging to him like a shroud. The nightmares left him exhausted, his nerves frayed, his grip on reality loosening with each passing night. Some of the crew, those whose minds were more susceptible, began to exhibit more overt signs of paranoia. They would eye each other with suspicion, their conversations becoming hushed and guarded. A shared meal would be interrupted by accusations, by sudden outbursts of anger fueled by unseen grievances. Men who had sailed together for years, who had faced death side by side, now recoiled from each other, their bonds of camaraderie frayed by the insidious whispers of the corruption. They spoke of feeling watched, of hearing footsteps on the deck when no one was there, of seeing fleeting shadows dart across the periphery of their vision. The fear that had been a collective dread of the island was now morphing into a personal, internal terror, a fear of each other and of the darkness that was blooming within them. The ship, their supposed refuge, had become a cage, and the bars of that cage were woven from their own unraveling sanity. One of the older sailors, a man named Silas, who had seen more years at sea than Thorn cared to count, began to weep constantly, not out of grief, but out of a profound, existential despair. He would sit by the rail, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of the sea, and mutter about the futility of it all, about the vast indifference of the cosmos, about the terrifying insignificance of human endeavors. His pronouncements, once dismissed as the ramblings of an old man, now carried a chilling resonance, echoing the deep-seated dread that Thorn felt coiling in his own soul. Silas spoke of a coldness that had settled over the ship, a spiritual frost that was numbing their very souls, stripping away their will to live, their capacity for joy. He described it as if the ship itself was slowly freezing from the inside out, not with ice, but with a metaphysical desolation. The ship's wood, as if weeping in sympathy with Silas's despair, began to exude a dark, viscous fluid in certain places. It was not pitch, nor bilge water, but a thick, oily substance that had a faint metallic tang and a cloying, earthy scent, reminiscent of disturbed grave soil. It would seep from the pores of the oak, from the joints where planks met, appearing as small dark droplets that would slowly coalesce and run down the hull, leaving glistening trails. Thorn had ordered some of it collected, sealed in a jar, but even the glass seemed to offer little containment. The fluid would shimmer with an unnatural iridescence, and sometimes, when the light caught it just so, he could swear he saw the faint, shifting outlines of those accursed geometric patterns within its depths. The crew avoided these weeping patches, their fear of the unknown manifesting in a superstitious avoidance of any anomaly that spoke of the island's touch. They spoke in hushed tones of the albatross bleeding, of her succumbing to a wound that could not be healed. The subtle manifestations continued, each one a tiny pebble dropped into the placid pool of their routine, creating ripples of unease that spread outwards, disrupting their sense of normalcy. A knife, left on a mess table, would be found inexplicably on the deck. A coil of rope, neatly stowed, would be discovered inexplicably unraveled, its strands fanned out as if by a playful, unseen hand. These were not acts of sabotage. There was no malice behind them, no intent to cause harm. They were simply oddities, disorienting deviations from the expected order of things that, when accumulated, began to wear down the crew's mental fortitude. The ship, they felt, was no longer entirely under their command. It was alive in a way they did not understand, and its sentience was not benign. Even the mundane tasks of shipboard life became imbued with a sense of dread. Swabbing the deck was no longer a simple chore, but an act of vigilance, as one might find oneself meticulously wiping away a dark stain that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, only to realize moments later that the stain had not been there before. Sharpening the knives became a nerve-wracking experience, the rhythmic rasp of steel against whetstone punctuated by the unsettling feeling of being observed. The very air seemed to thrum with an unseen energy, a latent power that could manifest at any moment, in any way. It was a pervasive, suffocating atmosphere of latent dread, a constant awareness that the veil between their reality and something far more terrible had thinned, and that the other side was seeping through. Thorne, as captain, felt the weight of these subtle shifts most acutely. He was responsible for his crew, for their safety, and for the integrity of his vessel, and he could see, with a clarity that chilled him to the bone, that both were rapidly deteriorating. The Albatross, his faithful ship, was not merely carrying them away from Isla del Devorador, it was carrying Isla del Devorador within itself. The contagion was not just in the air or in the wood, but in the very essence of the ship, a slow-acting poison that was corrupting everything it touched. He knew, with a grim certainty, that the horrors they had witnessed on the island were not confined to its accursed shores. They had followed them, clung to them, and were now spreading, like a spectral plague, through the vast, unsuspecting expanse of the ocean. The subtle manifestations were not just signs of a ship under duress. They were the heralds of a cosmic infection, a geometric madness that was now setting sail towards a world blissfully unaware of the creeping geometric horrors that were being carried across its azure expanse. The journey home was no longer a passage of return, but a descent, a journey into a deepening darkness that was beginning to consume the very soul of the Albatross. The pervasive sense of unease that had settled upon the Albatross had begun to manifest in subtler, yet more disturbing ways, no longer confined to mere auditory illusions or displaced objects. It was a creeping alteration of perception, a slow warping of reality itself, directly attributable to the lingering influence of Isla del Devorador. The very fabric of their visual world, once a reliable anchor in the vast, chaotic sea, was now subtly unraveling, replaced by a disquieting new order. It began with the rigging. Men who had spent decades aloft, their eyes intimately familiar with the proud, functional lines of mast and sail, found themselves staring at the complex network of ropes and pulleys with a growing sense of bewilderment. The familiar angles seemed to shift, to twist into impossible configurations that defied the logic of physics and salesmanship. A taut staysail sheet, which should have run in a clean, unbroken line from spar to deck, would suddenly appear to bend mid-air, forming a sharp, unnatural apex that served no purpose but to offend the eye. The intricate lacework of shrouds and ratlines, once a testament to human ingenuity and the forces of nature harnessed, now seemed to suggest an underlying alien architecture. Sailors would rub their eyes, convinced the salt spray or the glare of the sun was deceiving them, but the impossible angles persisted, shimmering at the edge of their vision like phantom limbs. "Look there, Mr. Davies," a young sailor named Finn stammered one afternoon, pointing a trembling finger towards the foremast. "The port shrouds. They don't meet the mast properly. There's a gap, sir, a devil's gap, wider than any hand." Davies, a grizzled veteran who prided himself on his unwavering composure, followed Finn's gaze. He saw only the familiar sturdy lines of the Albatross's rigging, taut and true against the vast blue canvas of the sky. Yet as he looked closer, a cold knot of unease tightened in his gut. He couldn't pinpoint it, but Finn was right. There was something wrong. The lines seemed to diverge, to curve in ways that made his stomach churn, creating a fleeting three-dimensional illusion of impossible intersections. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a fatigue-induced hallucination. But the seed of doubt was sown. The very curve of the Albatross's hull, a familiar benevolent arc that had carried them through countless storms, began to play tricks on their minds. Looking along the length of the ship from the stern, the graceful sweep of the wooden planks seemed to contort, to bulge outwards in unexpected places, as if the ship's familiar form was being subtly reshaped by an unseen sculptor. The lines of the deck, meticulously planked, would appear to converge at odd non-Euclidean points, creating a dizzying sense of spatial disorientation. A man leaning against the taffrail would swear the deck beneath him was not flat, but gently, unnervingly, curving upwards, as if he were standing on the interior surface of a colossal, distorted sphere. These were not the visual distortions of a rough sea. The ocean was relatively calm. These were internal distortions, hallucinations born not of external forces, but of a deeply unsettling internal corruption. Elias, ever the pragmatist, tried to find rational explanations. He theorized about optical illusions caused by the interplay of light and shadow on the varnished wood, about the effects of prolonged exposure to the sun and sea air on their eyesight. But his own experiences were beginning to mock his attempts at scientific reasoning. He found himself meticulously checking his charts, the precise lines and angles that had always represented order and navigation, only to see them flicker and waver before his eyes. The straight edges of the coastline on his maps would seem to curve. The plotted course lines would appear to bend and twist like sentient serpents. He'd slam his fist on the table in frustration, the solid oak offering a comforting, albeit temporary, reality. But the images would linger, ghosting the edges of his vision. "Captain," Elias said one evening, his voice strained, gesturing towards a hastily drawn diagram on a scrap of parchment. I don't understand this. I was charting the stars, and they arranged themselves differently, not in the patterns we know." Thorne, his gaze distant and unfocused, barely acknowledged Elias's distress. His own perception was a landscape of jagged edges and impossible depths, a consequence of the pervasive heart of malice that had taken root on Isla del Devorador and now bloomed within the Albatross. He saw the world not as it was, but as it was being subtly, terrifyingly reconfigured. The stars, once reliable celestial beacons, were the most potent source of this geometric madness. At night, the sailors would gather at the rail, gazing upwards at the familiar constellations. But the celestial tapestry was no longer a comforting sight. The Big Dipper seemed to fracture, its 7 stars rearranging themselves into an unsettling asymmetrical pattern that resembled a jagged cosmic wound. Orion, the mighty hunter, appeared distorted, his sword a series of sharp, intersecting planes, his belt a broken 3-pronged fork. New stars, or perhaps old stars seen in a new, terrible light, seemed to wink into existence, forming angular arrangements that pulsed with an alien light. They were not the gentle curves and spirals of celestial bodies. They were sharp, predatory angles, forms that whispered of dimensions beyond human comprehension. One particularly sensitive sailor, a young man named Thomas, who had always possessed a vivid imagination, began to sketch these disturbing celestial configurations in his logbook. His entries, once filled with mundane observations of wind direction and sea state, now devolved into frantic, almost obsessive drawings. He would meticulously render what appeared to be fractal patterns of starlight, intricate, repeating shapes that seemed to possess a terrifying, inherent logic. His pen would fly across the page, filling it with sharp lines, acute angles, and impossible vertices, as if his hand was being guided by a force beyond his control. "Look at it, Thomas," a shipmate, Silas, said one night, peering over his shoulder at the logbook. Silas, however, was no longer the man who wept for existential despair. A new, more unsettling form of madness had taken hold of him, a grim fascination with the encroaching geometric horrors. "It's beautiful in its own way, like the bones of the universe laid bare, the true shapes of things finally revealed." Thomas didn't respond, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He continued to draw, his hand trembling, as if transcribing a vision from a fevered dream. The ink seemed to flow from his pen with a will of its own, forming shapes that were both repellent and undeniably compelling. He was not merely observing the stars. He was being invaded by their alien geometry, his mind becoming a canvas for the cosmic infection. The heart of Malice, the epicenter of Isla del Devorador's corrupting influence, was not a physical object, but a pervasive psychic and geometric contagion. It was a concept, an idea, that had taken root in the very land, distorting the natural order and imprinting its unnatural symmetry onto all that it touched. And now, that contagion had found a new vessel, the albatross. The ship, once a symbol of human dominion over the sea, was becoming an extension of the island's malevolent geometry. Elias, observing these changes in his crewmates with growing alarm, recognized the disturbing parallels. He had seen similar unsettling arrangements of lines and angles etched into the rocks of Isla del Devorador, glimpsed fleetingly in the distorted reflections of the water. He had tried to dismiss them as the product of his own frayed nerves, but now they were manifesting on his ship, in the minds of his men. "Captain Thorne," Elias pleaded, his voice a raw plea for reason. "The men are seeing things, the rigging, the stars. It's not just fatigue. It's the island, sir. It's still with us. It's in us." Thorne, however, remained largely withdrawn. The trauma of Isla del Devorador had calcified within him, leaving him adrift in a sea of his own internal torment. He saw the geometric distortions, felt the unsettling shifts in perception, but they were merely echoes of the grander, more terrifying reality that had consumed him on the island. He could no longer distinguish between the ship's perceived madness and his own. The impossible angles were no longer external anomalies. They were becoming the very landscape of his fractured consciousness. He would stare at the compass, its needle now a source of profound dread, not because it spun erratically, but because its very shape seemed to alter, its arc momentarily elongating into a sharp, predatory curve. He would look at his own hands, and for a fleeting moment, the lines on his palms would transform into intricate, razor-sharp geometric lattices, a terrifying reflection of the island's curse. He was a captain without a bearing, a navigator lost in a sea of his own making, a sea where the lines between sanity and madness, between reality and illusion, were as warped and impossibly angled as the stars themselves. The contagion had not just spread across the ocean. It had burrowed deep into the very soul of the albatross and into the soul of its captain. The journey home was become a descent into a geometric abyss, a place where the familiar rules of space and sanity no longer applied, and where only the alien symmetries of the abyss reigned supreme. The ship, once a proud vessel of exploration, was now a floating monument to a cosmic horror, its timbers groaning not with the strain of the sea, but with the silent, agonizing contortions of its own geometric decay. The oppressive miasma that had clung to Isla del Devorador, a palpable scent of rot and stagnation, had not been left behind on its accursed shores. It had, with insidious stealth, become an unwelcome passenger aboard the albatross. What began as a subtle shift in the ship's atmosphere, a barely perceptible dampness that never seemed to dissipate, a lingering chill that even the sun's strongest rays could not entirely dispel, had escalated into a full-blown contagion of decay. It was a silent, pervasive enemy, far more insidious than any storm or kraken, for it ate at the very substance of their existence, at the tangible world they relied upon. The galley, once a place of bustling activity and the comforting aroma of simmering provisions, had become a crucible of premature decomposition. Freshly caught fish, still glistening with the sheen of the sea, would begin to lose their luster within hours, their flesh turning a sickly gray, their once firm texture becoming unnaturally soft and yielding. A sailor might carve a steak from a joint of salted beef, only to find the remaining portion of the same joint sprouting a fuzzy, vibrant bloom of mold by the next watch, the mold itself an unnatural shade of viridian and ochre, pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible luminescence. Bread, baked with care and expected to last for weeks, would become hard and brittle as stone overnight, or worse, soften into a pulpy, unidentifiable sludge. The air in the galley grew thick with the cloying sweetness of over-ripeness, a scent that spoke not of ripening fruit, but of death and dissolution. Even the water barrels, carefully sealed and filled with fresh rainwater, seemed to weep a brackish, discolored fluid, as if the very water molecules were succumbing to an unseen entropy. The tools of their trade, the instruments that allowed them to navigate and maintain the albatross, were not spared. Hammers, their heads once sturdy iron, began to show streaks of rust, not the usual superficial oxidation that could be buffed away, but a deep, creeping corrosion that softened the metal, making it crumbly and weak. The keen edges of knives and axes grew dull with alarming speed, the steel appearing to pit and degrade as if it had been left submerged in salt water for years. Seamanship's most vital components, the ropes and canvas, also succumbed. Ropes that had been painstakingly coiled and stored, taut and strong, would be found frayed and brittle, individual fibers disintegrating at the slightest touch. The sails, their broad expanses, once a proud declaration of their sage, developed a peculiar stiffness, then a fragility, as if the very threads were succumbing to an invisible rot. Sailors would mend a tear, only to find it widening in another spot within a day, the canvas crumbling away like ancient parchment. But it was the wood of the albatross itself that offered the most chilling testament to the pervasive aura of decay. The sturdy oak and pine timbers, the very bones of the ship that had weathered countless tempests, began to show their age with terrifying acceleration. Patches of the hull, once smooth and resilient, took on a gray, weathered appearance, as if exposed to centuries of relentless sun and spray. The wood became brittle. A carelessly placed foot could send a splinter flying, not a sharp, pointed shard, but a brittle, flaky piece that dissolved into a fine dust on the deck. A sailor might tap a hull plank to test its integrity, and the resulting sound, once a solid thud, would now be a hollow, resonating creak, a sound that echoed the ship's growing frailty, the caulking between. The planks would shrink and crack, not from dryness, but from a deep-seated decomposition, leaving hairline fissures that hinted at the sea's hungry embrace. The smell of damp, decaying wood began to permeate the ship, a scent that was no longer merely unpleasant, but deeply unsettling, a scent that spoke of a living thing succumbing to an unseen, internal death. The men, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of the sea and the slow, steady wear and tear of a long voyage, found themselves confronted by a new, terrifying pace of deterioration. It was not merely the ship that was aging, it was they themselves who were beginning to exhibit the signs of this accelerated decay. Elias, meticulous in his observations, began to notice small, localized manifestations of this dread power, fragments of a larger, horrific phenomenon. Young Finn, the same sailor who had first spoken of the impossible angles in the rigging, suffered a minor accident while working in the sail loft. A sharp awl slipped from his grasp, grazed the tip of his left index finger. It was a superficial wound, barely drawing blood, the kind that would heal within days with a simple bandage. But on the Albatross, with the contagion spreading, such mundane events took on a ghastly significance. By the evening of the same day, Finn's finger was no longer merely cut. It was swollen, a deep, angry purple marring the skin around the small puncture. The flesh had begun to darken, a velvety blackness spreading like an ink stain from the wound. By morning, the sight was enough to send a wave of nausea through the onlookers. The fingertip was a shriveled, blackened husk, as if it had been dipped in corrosive acid. The flesh seemed to be detaching itself from the bone, a putrid, viscous fluid weeping from the edges. It looked not like a wound, but like a piece of meat left too long in the sun, or a branch that had died and begun to rot on the tree. "Ah, by the saints, Finn, what happened to your hand?" asked Silas, his voice a strained whisper, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that eclipsed his previous morbid fascination. Silas, who had begun to find a strange, unsettling beauty in the geometric distortions, now recoiled from this visceral display of decay. Finn, his face pale and clammy, held up his hand, his expression a mask of terror and disbelief. It just happened, Silas. I barely cut myself, and then it was like this. It burns, but not like a fire. It burns like it's being eaten from the inside. The ship's surgeon, a man named Abernathy, was summoned. He was a competent, if somewhat weary, physician. more accustomed to treating scurvy and battle wounds than whatever unholy affliction was now plaguing them. He examined Finn's finger with a grim expression, his brow furrowed in bewilderment. He had seen gangrene before, of course, but never with such astonishing speed, such unnatural ferocity. The blackened flesh was not merely dead. It seemed to be actively disintegrating, crumbling away from the bone. He attempted to clean the wound, to apply salves and bandages, but the process was like trying to staunch a wound that refused to bleed, a wound that was actively consuming itself. "This is unprecedented," Abernathy muttered, his hands recoiling from the putrid scent. "The flesh, it's like it's turning to dust, literally turning to dust." The sailor next to him, a burly man named Gregor, gagged and turned away, his face a sickly green. "Like the stones on the island," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "The stones that crumbled when you touched them." Elias, observing the scene with a chilling clarity, felt a cold dread settle deep into his bones. He remembered the crumbled stones of Isla del Devorador, how they had disintegrated into fine, dry powder at the slightest pressure. He remembered the unnerving tactile sensation, the feeling of something vital being leached away. And now it was happening to Finn. It was happening on their ship. The contagion, he realized with a sickening certainty, was not merely an external force that had touched them. It had lodged itself within them, within the very fabric of the albatross, and it was now manifesting in the most horrifying way imaginable. The accelerated physical disintegration of living matter. Finn's finger continued to worsen with terrifying speed. By the end of the day, the blackness had crept past the knuckle, the putrid stench filling the cramped confines of the sick bay. The flesh was no longer merely soft, it was desiccated, leathery, and brittle, like old parchment. When Abernathy attempted to probe the wound, a section of the blackened fingertip simply detached and fell onto the examination table, a small crumbling piece of what had once been living flesh, already dissolving into a fine, dark powder. It was a miniature representation of the island's curse, a terrifyingly literal embodiment of the decay that had taken root. "We have to cut it off," Abernathy declared, his voice tight with a mixture of professionalism and sheer terror. "We have to remove it before it spreads." The amputation was a crude, desperate affair. Under the flickering lamplight, with Finn screaming in a raw, primal agony, Abernathy sawed through the bone. The bone itself, when the saw bit into it, seemed unusually dry and brittle, offering less resistance than it should have. As the severed fingertip was dropped into a bucket of seawater, it dissolved almost instantly, leaving behind only a faint, dark residue. The wound itself, though cauterized with a searing hot iron, seemed to weep a thin, dark fluid that Abernathy could not identify, a fluid that hinted at an internal rot that his medical knowledge could not combat. The incident with Finn's finger sent a ripple of profound fear through the crew. They looked at their own hands, at the minor nicks and scratches they had sustained over the years, and imagined them turning black, crumbling to dust. They looked at the ship's timbers, at the ropes, at their dwindling provisions, and saw not the familiar signs of wear and tear, but the inexorable march of a supernatural decay. The albatross, once their sturdy protector, their home on the unforgiving sea, was becoming a tomb, its very substance being consumed by the lingering malice of Isla del Devorador. They had sailed away from the island, believing they had escaped its grasp. But they had, in fact, brought its curse with them. It clung to their clothes, it seeped into their food, it tainted their water, and it was now actively disassembling their very bodies. The journey home was no longer a race against time to return to civilization. It was a desperate race against the encroaching tide of dissolution, a tide that threatened to drown them all in a sea of dust and rot. The aura of decay was no longer a distant threat. It was the very air they breathed, the very substance of their doomed voyage. Elias moved through the albatross with a quiet, purposeful tread, his eyes missing nothing. The decay that had begun to manifest so overtly, so viscerally, was now interwoven with a subtler, more insidious rot, the decay of order, the disintegration of reason. He found himself cataloging not just the physical ailments that afflicted the ship and its crew, but the slow erosion of their collective will. Each creak of a weakened plank, each patch of accelerated rust, was mirrored by a growing unease in the men's eyes, a furtive glance, a whispered rumor. His logbook, once a sterile record of navigation and weather, was becoming a repository of anxieties. He penned entries with a meticulous hand, each word chosen with care, attempting to impose a semblance of logic upon the unfolding chaos. He recorded the precise measurements of warped timbers, the unusual discoloration of the brine in the barrels, the unnerving speed at which the ship's iron fittings surrendered to corrosion. He wrote of the sailors' increasingly frequent complaints, a phantom chill that settled into their bones, a recurring nausea, an inexplicable lethargy that no amount of grog could dispel. But beneath the factual accounts, his private thoughts wrestled with a nascent dread, a suspicion that these were not mere maritime ailments, but symptoms of a deeper, more malignant infection. He observed Captain Thorne with a growing concern that bordered on alarm. The captain, once a figure of resolute command, a man whose very presence could quell a mutiny and steady a panicked crew, was a shadow of his former self. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, now held a vacant, unfocused stare, darting about as if searching for unseen specters. He spoke in disjointed sentences, his pronouncements often nonsensical, laced with a desperate, almost childlike fear. Elias had seen him standing at the helm for hours, not steering, but simply staring out at the indifferent horizon, his lips moving in a silent, unheard prayer. Thorne's grip on reality was loosening with an alarming rapidity, a stark contrast to Elias's own desperate efforts to cling to it. The crew, sensing their captain's decline, looked to Elias with unspoken questions, their gaze a heavy weight upon his shoulders. The incident with young Finn's finger had been a turning point, not just for the sailor, but for Elias's perception of the unfolding events. While Abernathy, the surgeon, was still grappling with the medical impossibility of such rapid, unnatural decay, Elias saw a chilling pattern emerging. He recalled the crumbling stones of Isla del Devorador, the way they had disintegrated into dust at a mere touch. He remembered the pervasive, cloying scent of rot, the feeling of life being leached from the very air. Now, it was happening on their ship, to one of their own. The swiftness, the unnaturalness of Finn's affliction was not an isolated anomaly. It was a manifestation, a gruesome harbinger of what the island had truly unleashed upon them. Elias began to spend more time in the ship's stores, ostensibly to check on provisions, but in reality, to observe the subtle signs of decay. He found the hardtack, once a staple that could withstand weeks at sea, developing a soft, almost powdery interior, as if the very starch was being leached out. The salted meats, despite being packed in brine, seemed to weep a discolored liquid. Even the preserved fruits, usually bursting with sweetness, had a faint, unsettlingly earthy aroma, a scent that spoke of shallow graves rather than sun-kissed orchards. He meticulously logged each discovery, each instance of premature spoilage, his logbook growing thicker with these disquieting details. He also paid close attention to the sounds of the ship. The familiar groans and creaks of the albatross as she sailed were now interspersed with new, unsettling noises. There were soft, scrabbling sounds from within the bulkheads, like tiny claws skittering across dry wood. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would hear a low rhythmic thrumming, a sound so deep and resonant it seemed to emanate from the very heart of the ship, a morbid heartbeat that pulsed with an alien rhythm. He tried to attribute these to the wind, to the sea, to the settling of the timbers, but a primal instinct whispered that these sounds were born of something far more sinister. The crew, a collection of hardened sailors accustomed to the brutal realities of the sea, were succumbing to fear. Their bravado was replaced by a gnawing paranoia. They whispered amongst themselves, their voices low and urgent, casting suspicious glances at their shipmates. Minor disagreements escalated into heated arguments, fueled by an underlying tension that Elias could feel humming beneath the surface of their interactions. They looked at the dwindling supplies, at the wilting sails, at the darkening wood of the deck, and saw not the challenges of a long voyage, but the signs of their inevitable doom. Elias found himself increasingly in a position of informal leadership. When Captain Thorne retreated into his own private world of terror, it was Elias who addressed the crew, Elias who organized watches, Elias who ensured that the meager rations were distributed fairly. He did so not out of any desire for command, but out of a profound sense of responsibility. He saw himself as the last bulwark against the encroaching madness, the one who had to remain clear-headed when all others were succumbing to despair. His vigilance was not a product of ambition, but of a desperate, unwavering commitment to his shipmates, to the albatross itself. He fought to maintain the illusion of order, knowing that if that illusion shattered, they would all be lost. He noticed that certain areas of the ship seemed to be more acutely affected than others. The galley, as the hub of their daily lives and the source of their sustenance, bore the brunt of the contagion. The food spoiled with frightening speed, the air perpetually thick with the scent of decay. The sail loft, too, seemed to be a nexus of the affliction, the canvas becoming brittle and prone to tearing at an alarming rate. Elias began to suspect that the heart of malice, as he had begun to privately refer to the unseen entity that had taken root on their vessel, was not a uniform force, but something that pulsed and ebbed, concentrating its corrupting influence in specific locations. He started to map these hotspots in his mind, correlating them with the sailors' complaints and the physical manifestations of decay. He began to implement small, seemingly insignificant changes. He insisted that all food be stored in the driest, coolest parts of the ship, even if it meant a longer journey to retrieve it. He ordered that the tools be meticulously cleaned and oiled every night, a futile gesture against the creeping corrosion, perhaps, but one that offered a small measure of control. He encouraged the men to report any unusual sensations, any lingering chills or aches, no matter how minor, so that he could attempt to track the spread of the sickness. He was, in essence, trying to create pockets of normalcy, small bastions against the tide of unreality that was threatening to engulf them. One evening, while Elias was making his rounds, he overheard a hushed conversation between two of the older sailors, Silas and Gregor. They spoke of shadows that moved in the periphery of their vision, of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very wood of the ship, of a feeling of being watched by something ancient and malevolent. Silas, who had once been a pragmatist, now spoke with a tremor in his voice of the angles he saw in the rigging, the impossible geometries that defied the laws of physics. Gregor, a man of immense physical strength, confessed to a growing fear of the dark, a fear that he had never known even in the most violent of storms. Elias listened, his heart sinking. He had tried to maintain a rational facade, to present the crew with logical explanations and practical solutions, but the crew themselves were beginning to embrace the irrational, to give voice to the fears that he himself was struggling to suppress. The contagion was not just infecting their bodies and their ship, it was infecting their minds, twisting their perceptions, and eroding their shared reality. He found himself constantly on edge, his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. Every creak of the hull, every rustle of a sail, every sigh of the wind was scrutinized, analyzed, and then, often, dismissed as mere fancy. He would catch himself staring at the shadows for too long, his mind conjuring shapes that were not there, his imagination painting horrors onto the familiar confines of the ship. He fought these intrusions, gripping the railing of the deck, forcing himself to focus on the practicalities of their situation, the course of the ship, the dwindling supplies, the condition of the crew. He noticed a peculiar change in the ship's lanterns. The light they cast seemed to be weaker, dimmer, as if the very fuel that fed them was being leached of its potency. The shadows they cast seemed to deepen, to writhe and shift in a way that was deeply unsettling. He found himself preferring to work by the dim gray light of dawn or dusk, when the shadows were less pronounced, the sense of oppressive darkness less acute. One day, he found Captain Thorne slumped over his chart table, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with silent sobs. Elias approached him cautiously, his own voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Captain," he began, "we must make a decision about our course. The men are growing restless." Thorne looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Course," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "There is no course, Elias. We are adrift. We are sinking." He gestured vaguely towards the charts, not at any specific location, but at the very paper itself. "They are here," he rasped, "in the ink. They are everywhere." Elias felt a cold dread seep into his very soul. Thorne was no longer a captain. He was a prisoner of the same unnameable horror that Elias was fighting to keep at bay. He realized with a sickening certainty that if he did not step into the vacuum of leadership, if he did not maintain his vigil, the albatross would not merely succumb to decay, but to utter, unreasoning madness. He was no longer just the first mate. He was the anchor, the sole bulwark against the encroaching abyss, and the weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. His vigilance was no longer a choice. It was a necessity, a desperate, solitary stand against the unraveling of their world. The albatross, a vessel once proud and swift, now a decaying testament to a voyage gone horribly awry, turned its bow towards the distant, indifferent shores of Europe. Captain Thorne, his mind a tattered map of delusion and despair, had decreed the course. It was not a decision born of sound navigation or rational thought, but of a desperate, fractured yearning for absolution, a phantom hope that by returning to the familiar embrace of civilization, he could somehow unburden himself of the cosmic horror that had taken root within his soul and within the very timbers of his ship. He spoke in hushed, fervent tones of the treasure he had sought, his words laced with a feverish anticipation that Elias, his first mate, knew to be a cruel mockery of reality. Thorne clung to the illusion that the ill-gotten gains, whatever they truly were, would reveal themselves in a more palatable, more comprehensible form upon their return. He envisioned port officials, eager merchants, perhaps even a king's ear, all ready to bestow praise and reward upon his ill-fated expedition. He could not grasp, or perhaps refuse to acknowledge, the truth that Elias now understood with chilling certainty. Elias, his gaze fixed on the undulating expanse of gray water, felt the profound irony of their trajectory. They were not sailing towards riches, nor towards sanctuary. They were sailing towards a contagion, a plague of cosmic horror that had festered and mutated within the depths of their cursed journey. The island, the unnamed horror that had leached the very essence from their surroundings and their sanity, had not merely left its mark, it had woven itself into the fabric of their existence, a malignant seed carried upon the very salt spray that kissed their decaying decks. The Albatross was not a ship returning with plunder. It was a derelict vessel, a charnel house on the waves, carrying within its groaning hull a harbinger of an unprecedented era of madness and decay, a precursor to a world teetering on the precipice of an unnameable abyss. The vast, indifferent ocean, a canvas of eternal blue and gray, seemed to stretch out before them, a silent, mocking observer of their desperate, doomed voyage, its boundless expanse, a stark counterpoint to their finite, crumbling existence. "He believes he can outrun it," Elias murmured to himself, the words a phantom whisper against the ceaseless roar of the wind. He watched Thorn pacing the quarterdeck, a gaunt figure silhouetted against the bruised sky, his eyes vacant and yet strangely alive with a fervent, unreasoning purpose. Thorn would stop occasionally, tracing imaginary lines on the deck with the toe of his worn boot, muttering about currents and prevailing winds, as if the very laws of nature were still amenable to his command. But Elias saw only the frantic scrabbling of a drowning man, clinging to the flotsam of his shattered sanity. The captain's pronouncements were now a tapestry of fragmented thoughts, stitched together with threads of paranoia and a desperate, misplaced optimism. He spoke of presenting his findings, of exhibiting the artifacts, he called them, as if they were mere curiosities to be displayed in a provincial museum, rather than instruments of a cosmic unraveling. Elias felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Thorn's delusional quest would not end in absolution, but in the wholesale corruption of everything they held dear. The treasure Thorn so desperately sought was not gold or jewels, but something far more insidious, something that had latched onto the ship like a parasitic organism, feeding on its structure, its crew, and its very soul. It was a blight that had no terrestrial origin, a corruption that defied all known science and reason. He had seen its effects in the accelerated decay of the ship's timbers, in the unnaturally brittle canvas of the sails, in the peculiar, almost sentient way the rust seemed to bloom across the iron fittings. He had witnessed its insidious creep into the minds of his shipmates, transforming hardened sailors into trembling wrecks, their once sharp eyes now clouded with a pervasive, unfathomable fear. The crew, or what remained of them, moved through the ship like wraiths. Their faces were gaunt, their skin sallow, their movements listless. The once boisterous camaraderie had long since evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, unspeakable fate. They avoided each other's eyes, their whispers hushed and fearful, as if the very act of speaking too loudly might draw the attention of the unseen forces that haunted their voyage. Young Finn, his bandaged finger still a ghastly reminder of the island's touch, spent his days staring blankly at the churning sea. his youthful exuberance replaced by a vacant, unnerving stillness. Abernathy, the ship's surgeon, a man who had faced the grim realities of disease and injury with stoic resolve, now moved with a haunted weariness. He had run out of remedies, his medical bag filled with salves and poultices that proved as useless against this alien contagion as a child's toy against a tidal wave. He would sit in his cramped cabin, poring over his own increasingly desperate notes, his brow furrowed with a bewilderment that mirrored Elias's own. "He's charting a course for oblivion," Elias had confided to Abernathy a few nights prior, his voice barely a whisper against the groaning of the hull. "He believes he can sail back to safety. He doesn't understand that we are no longer sailing on the sea, but through it, carrying its rot with us." Abernathy had merely shaken his head, his eyes sunken and hollow. "We are all carrying it, Elias. It is within us now, as much as it is in the ship. I see it in their eyes. The fear. It is the fear of the unknown made manifest. They feel it, even if they cannot name it." Elias understood. The contagion was not merely a physical affliction. It was an existential one. It was a disease that attacked the very foundations of sanity, gnawing away at reason, at memory, at the very perception of reality. He saw it in the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and writhe in the corners of his own vision, in the way the rhythmic creak of the albatross sometimes seemed to resolve into a disturbing, guttural whisper. He fought these intrusions, clinging to the tangible, to the meticulous records he kept in his logbook. He documented the precise degrees of warp in the deck planks, the alarming speed at which the ship's provisions were succumbing to an unnatural spoilage, the unsettling discoloration of the very brine in the water barrels. He wrote of the sailors' increasingly peculiar complaints, a phantom chill that no amount of effort could dispel, a recurring nausea that no amount of sea air could alleviate, an inexplicable lethargy that seemed to sap their very life force. But beneath the veneer of factual reporting, his private thoughts grappled with a terrifying truth. These were not mere maritime ailments, but the outward manifestations of a deeper, more profound corruption. Captain Thorne's delusion was a double-edged sword. It provided a semblance of direction, a visible objective for the increasingly fractured crew, even if that objective was a mirage. It prevented the complete descent into abject despair that Elias had feared. However, it also meant that the ship was now sailing directly into the heart of humanity's unsuspecting world, a vessel of silent, insidious doom. The vastness of the ocean, which had once been a barrier, a safeguard against the world's prying eyes, now felt like an open invitation to disaster. Each league they covered brought them closer to ports teeming with life, to cities unaware of the insidious darkness they carried. Elias found himself increasingly burdened by the weight of responsibility. While Thorne was lost in his spectral treasure hunt, Elias was the one tending to the sick, rationing the dwindling supplies, and attempting to maintain a fragile semblance of order amongst the terrified remnants of his crew. He would spend hours poring over charts, not to plot a course towards a non-existent haven, but to understand the currents, the prevailing winds, anything that might offer a sliver of control in a situation that felt increasingly dictated by forces beyond human comprehension. He found himself scrutinizing the faces of his men, searching for any sign of hope, any flicker of resilience, but he saw only the encroaching shadow, the subtle erosion of their will. He remembered the island with a visceral clarity that still made him shudder, the oppressive humidity that clung to the skin like a shroud, the unnatural silence that swallowed all sound. the way the very air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. He recalled the strange, geometric patterns etched into the stone, patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves when he wasn't looking. And the smell, a cloying, sweetish odor of decay, and something else, something ancient and deeply unsettling, a scent that spoke of forgotten aeons and unimaginable cosmic indifference. He had thought, in his desperate ignorance, that by fleeing the island, by setting sail back into the familiar embrace of the sea, they had escaped its clutches. Now, he knew with a chilling certainty that the ISL had not released them. It had merely sent them forth, its insidious influence a plague carried on the salty breeze, a cosmic infection spreading its tendrils across the unsuspecting world. As they drew closer to the coast of Europe, the ship's decay seemed to accelerate. The wood grew more brittle, the metal more prone to rust. Even the paint, once vibrant, began to peel and flake away, revealing the dark, decaying timber beneath, like exposed bone. The whispers among the crew grew louder, more desperate. They spoke of seeing things in the water, shapes that defied earthly description, of hearing voices carried on the wind that spoke in tongues long dead. Elias tried to dismiss these as the ravings of men on the brink, but a chilling doubt gnawed at him. Was it possible that the ocean itself, the vast, seemingly eternal ocean, was also beginning to succumb to this unseen corruption? Was the treasure Thorn sought not merely an artifact of the island, but a symptom of a far greater, more universal decay? Captain Thorn, however, remained resolute in his delusion. He would stand at the helm for hours, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his lips moving in a silent, fervent prayer. He would speak of the riches that awaited them, of the acclaim he would receive, of the way this voyage would cement his name in history. Elias would watch him, a profound sadness washing over him. Thorn was not a captain anymore. He was a prophet of doom, his misguided faith leading them all towards an unimaginable catastrophe. The hope Thorn clung to was a dangerous fallacy, a whisper of redemption in the face of an absolute cosmic damnation. The ship's stores, once meticulously organized, now presented a scene of accelerating ruin. The hardtack crumbled to dust at a touch. The salted meats oozed a discolored, fetid liquid, and the preserved fruits had taken on a disturbingly earthy aroma, as if they had been plucked from a freshly disturbed grave. Elias logged each instance of spoilage with a meticulous hand, his logbook becoming a grim testament to the pervasive decay. He tried to devise new methods of preservation, to seal the dwindling provisions in wax, to bury them in the driest parts of the hold. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with cupped hands. The very air seemed to carry the contagion, a silent, invisible force that leached the life from everything it touched. The rhythmic thrumming that Elias had noticed weeks ago had become more pronounced, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the albatross. It was a sound that defied explanation, a morbid heartbeat that pulsed with an alien rhythm, a constant reminder of the unnatural presence that had taken root within their vessel. He found himself pacing the decks at night, listening to the symphony of decay, the groaning of the timbers, the scuttling sounds from within the bulkheads, and the persistent, unsettling thrum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He tried to find solace in the familiar patterns of the stars, but even they seemed to hold a cold, distant quality, as if they too were aware of the encroaching darkness. As they sighted land, a thin, hazy line on the distant horizon, a profound sense of unease settled over Elias. This was not the triumphant return Thorne envisioned. This was the arrival of a plague, the unleashing of an unspeakable horror upon a world that remained blissfully, terrifyingly unaware. The sea, the once boundless and awe-inspiring sea, now felt like a contaminated vessel, a conduit for the very essence of cosmic dread. He looked at Captain Thorne, his face alight with a feverish, almost manic joy, and knew that their voyage was far from over. It was, in truth, only just beginning. The Albatross was not returning home. It was delivering its terrible cargo, and the consequences, Elias feared, would be far more profound and devastating than any of them could possibly comprehend. The vast, indifferent ocean, that timeless witness to countless human endeavors, seemed to offer no solace, no judgment, only an endless expanse of deepening mystery, mirroring the abyss that had opened within their souls.